Kelly also spoke to the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, for a new profile of Donald Trump that outlines what Goldberg calls the former president's deepening preoccupation with dictators and his disdain for the American military. The title of the piece quotes Trump as once having said, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had." Trump adding, people who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. Trump made the remark during a private conversation in the White House, according to two people who overheard the comment. Goldberg asked retired General Kelly this week about Trump's remarks concerning German generals. Kelly told Goldberg when Trump raised the subject, he responded by asking, "Do you mean Bismarck's generals?" Kelly went on, quote, I knew he didn't know who Bismarck was or about the Franco-Prussian War. I said, do you mean the Kaiser's generals? Surely you can't mean Hitler's generals." And he said, yeah, Hitler's generals, quoting Trump there. Kelly explained to Goldberg that Rommel had to commit suicide after taking part in a plot against Hitler. Kelly said Trump was not acquainted with Rommel. Let's bring in the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, and staff writer at The Atlantic, Anne Applebaum. Good morning to you both. Jeffrey, just extraordinary stuff from General Kelly there, combined with what he told Mike Schmidt there on tape for the New York Times. There's been criticism from General Kelly of Donald Trump, not this direct and perhaps not so direct about his praise for Hitler and wanting his generals to be loyal to him the way Hitler's generals were, of course, not knowing the history of the repeated plots against Hitler by his own military. What stood out to you in your conversation?
Well, it's just that it's the comprehensive ignorance, I think, of history. Look, we don't expect presidents to be historians. But they have to be aware of what's happened before them, and they have to be aware of broad trends, geopolitical trends, historical trends. But I think Donald Trump lived in a kind of vacuum of his own making, in which he would take little snippets of information that he's heard and turn them into full narratives about the way the world worked. And what really struck me the most, and we've been talking about this for years now, is the complete lack of a learning curve on the part of the former president. In other words, John Kelly, Marine General, Chief of Staff, says, you know, Hitler's generals tried to kill him multiple times. And he said, and Donald Trump said, no, they didn't. So it's you can live in a bubble of your own creation. Now that's fine for a lot of people, but it's not fine for a president of the United States. Obviously the other piece of this, to me, and again, I've been reporting on this for years, is his very strange disdain for service people, particularly those who were captured, going back to John McCain and even George H.W. Bush, who he called a loser for being shot down by the Japanese in World War II. The disdain, as you note before, for people who are wounded in combat. Multiple examples in my story of his desire to have big military parades, but without amputees, because, as you reported, they make him look bad. So, I mean, there's a whole range of things here. We've been talking about these things for a while. This is more and more evidence to suggest that he has a very, very dysfunctional relationship with the ideas that animate U.S. military service.
Jeff, it's interesting that John Kelly is speaking to you, speaking to Mike Schmidt now, so soon and close to the election. Did you get a sense from him in your interviews about what he thinks a second Trump term might look like, and what would be different in terms of the guardrails that we were talking about earlier in a second term?
It's a very good question, and we've heard this not only from John Kelly, but essentially, if you talk to anyone of the so-called grown-ups who served in the first administration, they understand that the guardrails are going to be down. Our colleague at The Atlantic, David Frum, said that the issue with the next Trump term, a theoretical next Trump term, is that the velociraptors have learned how to turn the door handles. Which I think is a very vivid description of what could happen. In other words, last time, let's say the authoritarian impulses that a lot of people around Trump believe he has. John Kelly said this, obviously, according to Bob Woodward, Mark Milley, Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense. they believe that he has authoritarian impulses, but what we saw in the first term was a lack of ability or will or hard work to make those changes in the government, make those changes in America that he wanted to. But now combine the fact that he won't hire people like Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, H.R. McMaster, John Kelly. He's promised not to hire people like that, people with broad experience and probity and intellectual capacity. He's promised not to hire them. And they've figured out where they went wrong, let's say on the, immigration issues, for instance. I think that all of this group, including John Bolton, the former national security advisor, no softy, obviously, in a whole bunch of issues, believe that it could be a much more dangerous administration because he has a better sense, or the people around him have a better sense of what he wants to do or what he can achieve using the right mechanisms.
Ann, I think back, reading your works, reading your books, reading your warnings about the twilight of democracy.
Yeah.
Many people talked about catastrophizing this past week. As I've said on this show since Monday, the Wall Street Journal mocked the, quote, fascist meme, mocked the Atlantic, mocked other people who had been raising these concerns. And yet you now have the former president's longest-serving chief of staff saying he's a fascist. You have the former president's chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying that Donald Trump was fascist to the core. You have Donald Trump saying over the past week he's going to arrest his political opponents, that they are enemies of the state. Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, he said he wants to shut down CBS because he didn't like how they edited an interview. He's also threatened Comcast. He's threatened ABC. He's threatened everybody that stands in his way. And yet, so many people I talk to are just numb. They're not listening.
Can't comprehend.
I talk to some of the most highly educated people, and they'll say, "Are you concerned about Donald Trump talking about using the military against his political opponents?" Oh, I didn't hear that. And then you play the quote for them, or you show them the quote. They go, "Oh, he doesn't mean that." I'm sorry, but is this how it happens here? Is this how it happens here?
First, let me say about the Wall Street Journal article, it was particularly dismissive of an article that I wrote in The Atlantic.
Right.
And that article was really just a list. I mean, I quoted some things that Trump said, and I compared them to things that had been said by other dictators, mostly in the 1930s and 40s. Not just Hitler, actually, but Stalin, the East German Stasi, Mao. All of them talked about their enemies as vermin. They used this language of, parasites. Yes. We need to eliminate these people from public life. This language about poisoned blood. They're poisoning the blood of the nation. I mean, that's directly from Hitler. And I went back and looked up the quotes and found them and so on. And the Wall Street Journal response was actually one I've heard from others, which was, first of all, he can't possibly mean it. That can't possibly be true. But also, look how terrible Kamala is. Look how bad the Democrats are. You say, and it's almost, there's actually a Polish expression, which is, and the word is symmetrism. Immediately we need to find something that's just as bad. And I think this is essentially a way of people saying, I'm going to vote for this guy for whatever reasons, because I think he's going to lower taxes or because he's in my political camp. And I need a reason to do it. And so and the reason I'm going to give you is that, as I said, Harris is just as bad or it's a joke. They can't take it seriously because if they did, it says something very ugly about them. And I think that's the stage that we're at now.
Well, Ann, we brought you up when I was reading the Wall Street Journal editorial, and I said, oh, this must be some left-wing writer for The Atlantic that came over from The Nation and was in the Young Marxist Club when she was growing up. And I said, no, wait a second. It's actually Anne Applebaum, who spent her entire life researching and detailing the crimes of Stalin, the crimes of the Soviet Union, pushing back against the Soviet Union when they were still in existence, pushing back against autocrats who would undermine the Western democracy, Western culture, Western freedom. And that's what's so shocking to me. It's not like not like they're attacking a longtime political foe. They're attacking somebody who's actually dedicated her life to the very things that they once stood for.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I did used to write for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, so, you know, in living memory.
So attacking against one of their own, exactly. but continue. How does this? I mean, I read it. I've read it every morning. I mean, it's the first place I go, and I read it every morning. And to see this happening, this whataboutism, the same week, you have somebody talking about arresting their political opponents. It's just so heartbreaking that this is where we've come.
Yeah, you know, I also think part of the problem is it's true that people, when you say Trump will be Hitler, which is, by the way, not what I said. I just said he's using some of Hitler's language and Stalin's language. People imagine Nazis or stormtroopers or something that just seems so incredible and far away from American reality. And that's true, but that's also because they don't have the imagination or maybe the knowledge to know how it is that democracies break down nowadays. Nowadays, most democracies fail not because of violence or a coup d'etat, but because a legitimate elected leader comes to power and then begins to dismantle institutions. He puts loyalists in the jobs instead of experts. He politicizes institutions that are supposed to belong to the whole nation, like the military or the Department of Justice, and makes them serve him and his political program. And, you know, we've seen this happen. I mean, it's what happened in Hungary. It's what happened in Turkey. I saw it happen in Poland. It's where I lived part of the time, as you know, and the Polish ruling party at that time tried to do this. They went through the steps. They didn't succeed in doing it fully, and so they eventually lost an election. But, you know, it's not as hard as you think to change the rules, to bring in new kinds of people, to use the law against media or against politicians that you don't like, to use the IRS against politicians you don't like. And there are precedents for it in American history, too. So it's not as if it's absolutely never happened before. So I find all of that eminently believable. But as I said, for people who are going to vote for him because of whatever reason, you know, they need to dismiss it, laugh at it, mock it, you know, tweet it with LOL, you know, lol at the top, because they don't want to admit to themselves what it is they're supporting.